Thank you, everyone, and great last group. It was really exciting to see this all come together at the end. My first question for you all, if you can think back throughout the process of working on your projects and the process of your thesis at large, was there a moment that you remember that you could share where something turned the corner? Either you discovered something that really made the difference and let you know you were on the right track, or a realization, or seeing something come together for the first time in real life?
Well, early in the semester in the fall, I was working on little stories in 3 different ways, and one exploration was storytelling during recess. And what I learned through that is while first graders knew in the classroom how to tell these stories, when they were doing it during recess, they opted for coloring. So what I realized is that when it's not facilitated, when the learning isn't facilitated, one can only take it so far. And when you want to reach younger students, I had to go into the classroom to get them to tell stories. Because when they have the option to color, they won't tell them the stories. Versus when you go to 4th and 5th grade, they were telling stories because they loved telling the stories. But in the younger grades, they opted for coloring. So that where my choice came then to follow the path of going into the classroom.
Yeah, so when I started my thesis project, I was pretty intent on designing tools for doctors and nurses, kind of attacking this healthcare experience from the back end. And for a long while, it was very hard to kind of find something that I could make a change in, because this was such a removed space. I'm not in hospitals all the time, and it was very hard to kind of see all the problems up front. All I was doing was hearing this, and I was very well versed in it, but I couldn't feel it. And then someone told me that, why don't you look at it from the patient experience, because that is what ties together all the problems that I've been looking at. And around that time is when my grandma went to the hospital. And so when I went to the hospital, I saw all the problems that doctors and nurses had talked to me about. And so that's kind of where it clicked, that I needed to kind of focus on how a patient might experience this, and then I can also start to, patients are the common denominator of this whole thing. And so that's where it kind of clicked, and I moved in that new direction.
Thank you.
One of the reasons that I chose to create a puzzle game was that I was trying to reach people who maybe otherwise would never think to begin to learn anything to do with programming, that wasn't interesting to them, or they never thought they would be good at it. And I thought there was something interesting in the kind of intellectual challenge of playing a puzzle game that was similar to the intellectual challenge of programming, even if what you were doing was very different. But as I was beginning to design it, I was worried that sometimes I was just maybe making a game that might be fun, but didn't really have that much to do with programming, or that that correlation wouldn't really be there, and so it would lose some of its educational purpose. And in testing, a number of times I ended up playing with people who knew lots about programming, programmed for a living or regularly, and they gave me feedback that the kind of sensation of playing the game, the part of their brain that they were using was very similar to the experience that they feel when they're programming, which made me feel more confident that I was on the right track with it.
A big pivot for me was before I developed the peer website, I was trying to make a discovery app. And I realized through playtesting, I had no idea how much goes into game mechanics and game design. And that was a big pivotal moment for me to say, let that go, and that wasn't the point.
Does one of you have a story, maybe not during the design process, but once you had a semi-functioning prototype of seeing a user actually testing something and having their like a personal either testimonial or reaction or something that really made a difference for you, either in a positive way or perhaps showed you that you had to do something different? Not just from your design, of course, that was the core of it, but from seeing what you thought might have been finished and then see an actual person respond. Did that happen to any of you?
Yeah, so once I had a working clickable prototype, I brought this to some nurses at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and they were able to see it. And previously, I had designed this app for kind of the acute scenario, like where my grandma was, where it's just a short term, but you know, it's critical. But they saw it, and they saw this new potential in it for chronic patients and for cancer patients who are managing their care every day, every week. And so the nurse was clicking through it, and another nurse came in, and she started explaining what it did to the other nurse, and I didn't even have to say anything. And it was pretty rewarding to see that she was able to get the idea and be able to articulate that to another person pretty clearly.
Was that different for you? I remember you started designing for the nurses and doctors, and then you sort of switched to the patients themselves. Did you find that at the end that you started thinking, oh, maybe I could go back to that and it'll be useful for the staff as well?
Yeah, I did, because they say that like having a more informed patient also increases patient safety, it helps reduces the cost of hospitals, because then now when you have someone who understands what they're going through, they have better health outcomes, and they don't have to spend as much time in the hospital. And the time that they do actually interact with doctors or nurses are spent more meaningfully. So you can cut to the chase and ask more important questions and not ask maybe the questions that you could, get through Carebook.
Yeah, so I started user testing back in November, and asking simple questions. So I can say Little Stories was truly developed together with the kids by observing them, by talking to the teachers. And when I was talking to one of the teachers at PS3, she was saying, "Oh, kids don't know how to tell stories." And I'm like, "Oh, really?" And so my very first user test was, can kids tell stories? Asking that very basic question. And yes, absolutely they can. But it was interesting to me to see that teachers were doubting that kids could do that one had to tell them the stories versus them creating the stories themselves. And so that was the very first test. And so I was very lucky that the first grade teacher opened the classroom to me and let me teach a storytelling class. So I was on the board, like storytelling with Anke. And I had this experience of having to deal with 24 kids, and I was like, oh my goodness, and was able to experience what it feels like to be that teacher. And then realized very quickly that I needed to put things in place to organize and structure the collaboration. And so it was just like each user test was like a different question. How can I structure that experience more? At what point does it hinder creativity and so forth? So Little Stories was truly developed together with the kids.
Did you have a moment? I know you did tons of research and testing with the teachers, and you also experienced being a teacher yourself. Of course, you're observing the kids throughout and learning from them. Was there ever a kid who directly gave you a suggestion or told you something should be different?
When I was doing tests with my daughter and her friends, I had them fill out feedback forms, lots of feedback forms. But when I was in the first grade classroom, I just held up like a smiley face and then a frown face and got feedback that way. Not that detailed, but just by observing them, I could see where things were working and where they weren't working.
But your daughter, luckily, was already trained in user feedback testing reports.
And her friends now too, so.
Thank you.
I can probably talk about two testers from both ends of the spectrum. So at one end was a tester who had no knowledge at all of programming but loved Sudoku and immediately got really taken with the game, really was intently playing each turn, and was really deeply engaged and gave me a card, said as soon as it's out, let me know, send me an email. And the other end would be someone with lots of programming experience who was determined to figure out how to kind of game the game, figure out its workings and try and win in one turn kind of thing. And he also offered to get involved and help. He wanted to bring the game, he teaches programming, and wanted to bring the game into his class and offered his skills as part of the development process, which I never ended up using, but it was appreciated.
When I was play testing the Discovery app before the peer website, a lot of the teens told me, "Oh, this is great if for teens who didn't know what they wanted to do." And a lot of them have an inkling as to what they want to do, and it's more about letting them try that.
What do you think for each of you would be the most exciting thing to happen next? Not just like, well, I want to finish building it. In Sam's case, he's impressed us all by having an app actually on the App Store. And for many of you, you have semi-functional prototypes. So the obvious next step is to build it out even more. But what would be an exciting thing in terms of how it's used that you might want to discover or see it spread out into the world?
I would say that Duel can't really exist on its own as an educational tool. It's a starting point, and there needs to be a forward journey from that, which I try to encourage in the materials around the game. But if it became part of a more structured educational process, so if an organization who had a focus like that wanted to bring it into their process, I think that would help it achieve more.
Would you like to see it as part of school curriculum?
Sure.
By the way, I think it's interesting. I don't know how clearly you mentioned it, but although it's a game that can be played by kids, it's also meant for adults, really.
Totally, yeah.
Which is an interesting balance, having it be simple enough for kids, but complex enough for adults.
Yeah, that was a focus early on, was that there's lots of materials available for kids, and it's beginning to become, to really pick up momentum in terms of we need to be doing more about teaching kids to have this kind of literacy. But lots of adults are well behind in that and are never going to have that kind of infrastructural opportunity to learn. But they are going to be just as affected by the rapid changes around us. So I'm keen that adults don't feel like it's too late. It took me 29 years to figure out that this is something I liked, so it's never too late.
And Anke, for you, especially now that you received this award, you're going to try to fight the bureaucracy of the school system? Are you going to try to get this into actual curricula?
Well, in an ideal world, yes. I would love for this to be an educational tool that is used in the New York City and US as part of the education system. But I know that's a long way getting there. So for now, the goal is to just get it into more classrooms. And ultimately, it's a framework. So it needs a fantastic teacher who can bring it to life, like Magnus did, as you saw him in the video. Like, he went with it, and he made this extraordinary experience for the students by who he was and what he did with the framework. He actually, which is not in the video, he added on another segment called Reader's Theater. So in addition to the kids storyboarding their stories, he had them write dialogue so that they could continue like collaboration and then had to role play the stories that they had created storyboarding. So, and that was his initiative to turn it and to develop it further and add a writing component. And to me, that was just inspiring to see and observe him run the class. So it needs teachers behind it who can then execute it.
Thanks, Amy.
Along those same lines, outside of the peer web platform, I think it's about the people and the organization. So it would be amazing to see the teens turn into the mentors, and for the youth organizations that are part of peer to see that teens are connecting in different ways and how they change their structure as well.
Right, that's one amazing thing about your project. You have a built-in system to keep it self-perpetuating. In the beginning, you have to find the mentors, but then once you get teens to participate, if they were inspired by it, they become the next mentors for the next generation.
Yeah, it's about paying it forward.
So I would like to partner with a hospital to test this with patients, a group of them, and see how I could improve on the current prototype of Carebook. In the longer future, it would be great if I would like to continue that partnership and see if it could be rolled out in a pilot program.
Great, thank you so much. I am very excited to see all 4 of these projects extend further into the real world. They're already there, and it's going to be great to see them hopefully spread even farther. So thank you to our last group, and congratulations.
Make a change in, because this was such a removed space. I'm not in hospitals all the time, and it was very hard to kind of see all the problems up front. All I was doing was hearing this, and I was very well versed in it, but I couldn't feel it. And then someone told me that, you know, why don't you look at it from the patient experience, because that is what ties together all the problems that I've been looking at. And around that time is when my grandma went to the hospital.
That really made the difference and let you know you were on the right track, or a realization, or seeing something come together for the first time in real life?
Well, early in the semester in the fall, I was working on little stories in 3 different ways, and one exploration was storytelling during recess. And what I learned through that is, while first graders knew in the classroom how to tell these stories, in the younger grades, they opted for coloring. So that where my choice came then to follow the path of going into the classroom.
Yeah, so when I started my thesis project, I was pretty intent on designing tools for doctors and nurses, kind of attacking this healthcare experience from the back end. And for a long while, it was very hard to kind of find something that I could.
When they were doing it during recess, they opted for coloring. So what I realized is that when it's not facilitated, when the learning isn't facilitated, one can only take it so far. And when you want to reach younger students, I had to go into the classroom to get them to tell stories. Because when they have the option to color, they won't tell them the stories. Versus when you go to 4th and 5th grade, they were telling stories because they love telling the stories. But
Thank you, everyone, and great last group. It was really exciting to see this all come together at the end. My first question for you all, if you can think back throughout the process of working on your projects and the process of your thesis at large, was there a moment that you remember that you could share where something turned the corner? Either you discovered something